Hey everybody, I hope you're all doing well. Oh wow, this channel's really taken off and I appreciate it. It's all because of you. Please don't forget to subscribe, share it out, hit the like button. Tell your mother, tell your father, whoever you want to tell. Kids. We're going to be talking about every country England has invaded, visualized. This will be interesting.
For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world. The English and later the British have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain, Europe. Ireland.
All right, so I'm trying to think of everything that Britain has invaded. So I'm guessing like almost all of Europe. I'm thinking a good, maybe not Southeast Asia. Well, parts of Southeast Asia. Some South America. Well, we'll have to see how it goes, you know?
Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world. Just take a look at this huge list of invasions.
No.
There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367 and continued on through the first, second, third, and fourth raids on Cadiz, and that...
I did not know there were 4 raids on Cadiz. Sorry, I just... okay.
Time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever. In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians. But that wasn't always the case. They conducted 2 pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701. And Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch-rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion.
Yeah, I count it as an invasion too. That was one of the first places, I believe in World War II, the Royal Marines, I think it was the Royal Marines they went to, before before Norway, and yeah, before they fought in, was it Narvik in Norway, and oh my gosh, come on, Denmark was invaded. So I believe that was one of the first actions of the war. But if I'm wrong, let me know down below.
Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190. Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948. But a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837. Austria was also invaded.
I had never even heard of that island. Heligoland? Okay. All right. That's a long time.
In 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade.
You occupied? I didn't know the British occupied Austria since, what, from 45 to 55? Is that about right?
Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was
As a matter of fact, Americans were involved in this too. The intervention in the Russian Civil War. Yeah, it was right after World War One and during the Spanish flu outbreak. It was a weird thing. The Japanese sent like 70,000 to guard the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Invaded by British Army units during the Crimean War, the British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British Army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95, fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time, the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus.
I didn't know about Bulgaria, actually. I had no idea. And I think they forgot Greece. I mean, you guys have been heavily involved in Greece, helping them. I guess it's not technically an invasion. In 41, was it 41 or 42? 41, I think. And then in the recapture, you were there for the recapture of Greece in 45, I think, late 44, I guess.
Was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960.
I love that you did stuff just to piss off the Turks. But to be fair, the Turks do deserve it a little bit.
Except for two.
And I know you didn't do it just to piss them off.
Two small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923.
So that would be the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey. Yeah. The failed Gallipoli campaign didn't help.
That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946, respectively.
Vichy France.
Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II.
Yep.
Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War.
By the way, Israel and Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the whole thing, look, it doesn't really count. It's a given. It's sort of like a rite of passage. You have to invade those countries. It seems like just a thing that people do forever since humans have been around.
One for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941.
Yep.
Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967.
You know what, and this makes sense. You're really talking about the foundations of the modern world, and I mean that in the idea of how we are today, not how this all happened, but if you keep that in mind contextually, if you're an American, I should say. I'm sure you guys are. If you're British, you've been taught this, but look at all these places. This is the modern world that you're looking at.
India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864 and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948. Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China...
What? I didn't know you guys had a hand in the Philippines?
Got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997.
Which I'm surprised that it was... Hong Kong surprises me. That's a different
And while
video.
not outright invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally...
Oh, don't forget, you guys didn't help invade North Korea at the police action event that we all decided to go to.
Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot. In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868.
It's hard to say with some of these because a lot of these are like, I don't want to say liberation. They're liberation of some of these, not a lot, I should say, are their liberation of French colonial states. A Vichy French, but then again, the Vichys they fought against, so maybe it is an invasion. Technicalities.
And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 18...
All right, I got to say this just because I just noticed this. This is, first of all, Washington spelled wrong. But if you look at the Washington Territory and the island, Vancouver Island, there was a border dispute there by the Hudson Bay Company kind of representing England. So it was a year before, it was actually like 6 months before our Civil War started. And we almost went to war with Great Britain over... essentially a pig being shot on an island that was sort of a gray area as to who owned it. And then the other thing is Americans, the more basic, understanding of American history from Americans don't even know that there was a War of 1812. You ask, like, when was the War of 1812? They're like, I don't know. And they give you some date. But the War of 1812 was a war that was kind of a stalemate for two weird reasons, and you can have your own reasons why, but one being that you were at war, Great Britain was at war with Napoleon, and France, and we declared war against the British because we were trading with the French, and there was this status that you guys had, which was anyone who traded with, I think at that point, was anybody on mainland Europe. Was actually the thing that they would search the ships, to make sure that you weren't actually trading with them. And then impressment happened, which means that the British took American sailors and put them on their ships to supplement the British Navy, Royal Navy. And it was, and the Americans did terrible. It was our first war, and we declared war. We were the ones who started it. Well, I guess we had to, but we tried to invade Canada like 3 different times, and it sucked. And well, we only won the last battle just because, you guys were done with it. The Napoleonic era was coming to an end, was at an end, and you were like, no, forget it. Let's just sue for peace. And that's what we did. That is what it is. But a lot of people don't know about that war, but it's sort of a sideshow to what goes on with Napoleon.
1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins Ear, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies.
Well, there was more than that. It was like French, British, and I forget what the other country was. Even Spain, I think, was involved in it. I'm not 100% sure, but somebody else was. Oh, maybe it was Austria. I can't remember, in 1861. But it was something that the states, while we were having our civil war, we were looking at going, what's going on in Mexico? But we have this thing called the Monroe Doctrine, which means that we'll defend any nation in the Americas from like European or outside rule. During our civil war, we just could not do that at all. But I'm kind of surprised at how much you guys have. I'm surprised about South America.
Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic.
I thought you guys invaded Venezuela, though. That's one maybe I'm wrong.
Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon.
So Spain, Paraguay, Paraguay, Brazil. I've gone through a lot of videos today trying to... Wow.
And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire. The empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British armed forces during some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries.
I'm going to stop it there. That is, that's pretty crazy. And it's not even including islands like the Falkland. Well, but those weren't really an invasion. There weren't indigenous people there. Look at that. Do you see that? Like, that's most of. I'm not going to say all the modern world, but that's a lot. I mean, most of it is a little weird. Like, you didn't. Britain didn't invade all of this, but. I'm surprised there wasn't more in Central Europe, like Poland or anything like that. But and I know most in here was French, German peppered in there. This was mostly Spanish. This really, the fact that there were no real taken lands other than Guyana was that's Spanish, Portuguese. The Caribbean islands were just fought over left and right. Of course, you guys had Canada, but wow, did they miss anything? Let us know. Let me know. Let us know. Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I really appreciate it, you guys. We're doing really well with this channel, and it seems like you're all on board. Keep the comments polite, and please share it out. Thanks. See y'all soon.